Why did the general stop mid-step, like the ground itself had warned him? No one noticed at first. Boots still scraped gravel. Conversations carried on. Wind moved across the range the way it always did, lifting dust, snapping flags, whispering distances only shooters bothered to hear. The woman stood where she had been all morning, slightly off to the side, not quite invisible but never centered. A place people stopped looking at. Her hands were steady around the rifle case. Too steady for someone being watched. Too practiced for someone who claimed to be just a contractor. The general's eyes were locked on her collar. A pin, small, almost unintentional, a detail meant to be missed by everyone except the one person trained to see it. He didn't raise his voice, didn't bark an order, he simply stopped walking. And the entire range felt it. Dakota felt it before anyone spoke. She didn't look up. She didn't need to. Her body recognized the silence the way muscles remember old injuries, the way breath tightens before impact. She had worn the pin without thinking. Or maybe she had known exactly what she was doing and told herself it didn't matter anymore. She had been wrong. The general took one step closer, then another, each one deliberate, measured, like he was approaching a live round he wasn't sure had been disarmed. "Where did you get that?" he asked. No accusation, no disbelief, just recognition. Dakota finally raised her head. For the first time that morning, her eyes met someone who wasn't looking past her. She felt exposed, not as a woman, not as a soldier, but as something older, something she had buried under routine and quiet hours and a badge that said contractor instead of rank. "I earned it," she said. The word landed heavier than any gunshot. Around them men shifted, pride stiffened, confusion rippled. The general's aides exchanged looks they tried to hide. One of the rangers laughed short, unsure, then stopped when no one joined him. The general exhaled through his nose, slow. "I didn't think anyone from that program was still breathing." Dakota swallowed. "Most of us are." The wind pushed harder across the range. The flags snapped like warnings. Somewhere behind them, steel targets waited, indifferent to reputations, indifferent to ghosts. The general straightened. His voice carried now, not loud but impossible to ignore. "Clear the line," he said. No one questioned him. As soldiers moved, Dakota felt something unfamiliar creep into her chest. Not fear, not pride. Reluctance. She had built a quiet life brick by brick. Early mornings, routine work, no spotlights, no call signs, no decisions that ended lives before breakfast. She had believed that if she stayed small enough, the past would stay buried. But the past had excellent eyesight. When the rifle was placed in front of her, she didn't touch it right away. She studied the range instead. The wind had shifted since earlier, subtle, a quarter change left at distance, mirage bending low near the scrub, heat rising unevenly off the rocks at 1,200. She felt the old instinct stir, the part of her that counted heartbeats without numbers. "You still know how?" someone asked behind her. Dakota didn't turn. "I never forgot," she said. "I just stopped listening." She lay down. The rifle fit her shoulder like memory, not comfort, familiarity. There was a difference. Breath in, hold, let the world narrow. The first shot broke the silence cleanly. Dead center. A murmur ran through the line. She ignored it. Second shot, farther. Wind compensated before thought caught up. Hit. By the third shot, the range had gone quiet in a way that had nothing to do with orders. This wasn't a demonstration. This was recognition. She felt it when the general stepped closer again, not impressed, not celebratory, something heavier. Regret. Because he knew what it cost to be this precise. And she knew what it took to stop. She rose after the final shot, without looking back at the target. "I don't do this anymore," she said quietly. The general nodded once. "That's what you all say," he replied, "until it matters." Dakota looked past him, toward the horizon, where distance erased detail. "It always matters," she said. "That's the problem." She walked away before anyone could ask the next question. But none of them forgot the way the rifle had gone still in her hands. What does it feel like to be underestimated when you've ended wars before breakfast? Dakota asked herself that as she packed equipment back into cases that no one else touched. Hands moved on autopilot, mind elsewhere. She could feel eyes on her now, not mocking, not dismissive. Evaluating. That was worse. Respect came with expectations. Expectations came with doors reopening. Doors led back to places she had escaped by choosing silence over glory. A younger soldier hovered nearby, pretending to check a data book. "You didn't flinch," he said finally. Dakota didn't look up, neither do surgeons. He frowned, then nodded like that made sense. "Were you scared?" he asked. She paused. "Yes," she said, "every time." He blinked, "But you still." "Fear doesn't stop you," she said gently. "It just reminds you what the cost is." He walked away quieter than he arrived. The general found her later away from the firing line. No audience, no aides. "You disappeared," he said. "I survived," she corrected. He studied her face, the lines that didn't come from age but from decisions that didn't have good outcomes. "You could teach," he said. "You could prevent mistakes." Dakota laughed once, soft, bitter. "I made mistakes," she replied. "I just lived with them." He waited, knew better than to push. "My daughter," Dakota said after a moment. "She doesn't know who I was. She knows who tucks her in." The general nodded. "Then stay," he said, "on your terms." She considered it, truly. The idea of shaping something instead of ending it, of turning instinct into restraint. "I won't lie to them," she said. "Good," he replied. "They've had enough of that." That night, Dakota sat alone in her car, hands resting on the steering wheel long after the engine cooled. She thought about the pin, about the rifle, about the men who had laughed that morning and gone quiet by afternoon. About the girl she used to be, who believed precision could fix anything. She took the pin off and placed it in the console. Not buried, just no longer worn. Why do the quiet ones always carry the heaviest weight? Training began without ceremony. Dakota didn't raise her voice, didn't posture. She corrected grips, adjusted stances, asked questions no one expected. "What do you hear before you shoot? What do you ignore? What do you assume?" They struggled more with the questions than the drills. One trainee broke down after missing repeatedly. Frustration cracked into shame. Dakota knelt beside him. "You're trying to prove something," she said. "The rifle doesn't care." He looked at her, eyes wet. "What did you prove?" he asked. She thought of a convoy that never knew her name, a mistake that saved no one. "Nothing," she said. "I learned." Weeks passed. Dakota went home every night. Her daughter asked why she smelled like dust and oil again. Dakota smiled and said, "Old habits." The past stayed where it belonged. Mostly. Until one night a call came. Not urgent, not dramatic. Just necessary. Dakota stared at the phone for a long time before answering. Some choices don't feel like choices at all. She stood on a ridge under unfamiliar stars, rifle steady, breath slow. This time she wasn't alone. She trained the shooter beside her, whispered adjustments, let someone else take the shot. It landed true. Dakota felt something ease inside her chest. She wasn't done. She was changed. When the general passed her weeks later, he nodded, not in recognition but in respect. Dakota returned it. No pin, no legend. Just a woman who knew when to pull the trigger. and when not to, because sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts. Why did the silence follow her into the parking lot like an accusation? Dakota didn't rush. She never did after a range day like that. Rushing meant adrenaline still had a say, and she'd learned, through years that didn't leave visible scars, that adrenaline lied. It made moments feel clean when they were. It made decisions feel simple when they would echo for decades. Her boots crunched on gravel with the same measured cadence she used on Overwatch. Even alone, she moved like someone who understood angles, lines of sight, how much of herself to reveal. She opened the truck door and paused, hand resting on the handle longer than necessary. The pin was still in the console. She hadn't meant to leave it there, or maybe she had. A test, a reminder, a quiet dare to herself to decide whether the past belonged to her or whether she still belonged to it. She shut the door without touching it. The drive home took her through long stretches of empty road, the kind where thoughts grew louder than engines. Radio off. Windows cracked just enough to let the desert air in. It smelled like heat and dust and something metallic she never quite named. She replayed the general's eyes when he'd seen the pin. Not surprise. Recognition. That was what unsettled her. Surprise could be dismissed. Recognition meant history. It meant shared language. It meant that no matter how carefully she'd rewritten her life, some chapters were written in ink that couldn't be erased. At a red light miles from base, her phone vibrated. She didn't look at it right away. She knew better. When she finally glanced down, it wasn't a number she recognized. No caller ID, no urgency coded into the vibration pattern. Just a message. Didn't think I'd ever see that pin again. Dakota felt her jaw tighten. She typed nothing. Another message came through. You still owe me a beer or an apology. I can't remember which. She exhaled slowly through her nose, closed her eyes for a brief second that felt longer than it was. Then she put the phone face down. Some ghosts didn't deserve replies. Home was quieter than usual. Her daughter was already asleep, backpack by the door, shoes kicked off in a way that would have earned a lecture if Dakota had been in a lecturing mood. She was. She stood in the doorway for a long moment, watching the steady rise and fall of a chest that didn't know what it meant to scan rooftops or calculate wind drift. Didn't know how close some lines could get before crossing into something you couldn't uncross. Dakota brushed a strand of hair away from her daughter's face and felt the familiar pull. Love, fierce and grounding, tangled with guilt that had no logical place but refused to leave anyway. She whispered goodnight to a room that didn't hear her. In the kitchen, she poured herself a glass of water and leaned against the counter, letting the cool seep into her palms. The house felt too still. Or maybe she was the one vibrating, wound too tight by a day that had reopened something she'd sealed with intention. She thought of the trainees' faces, the way they'd watched her not with awe but with confusion. They hadn't expected her to be quiet or precise or ordinary. They expected a myth. She had spent years dismantling that myth inside herself, piece by piece, turning the legend into a person who could sit at a kitchen table and worry about math homework instead of extraction windows. And yet, the rifle had fit. That truth sat heavy in her chest. She went to bed without checking the phone again. Sleep came in fragments. In one dream, she was back on a rooftop that no longer existed, watching a street that had once been full of movement. She waited for a shot she never took. In another, she was standing at a briefing table while voices spoke around her as if she weren't there, until suddenly all of them stopped. She woke before dawn with her heart racing, the echo of silence still loud in her ears. The message count on her phone read 3. She didn't open them. Training resumed 2 days later. No announcement, no formal introduction. Dakota arrived early as always and set up the range without assistance. targets at irregular distances, environmental variables adjusted without explanation. When the first group arrived, they looked uncertain. Good, she thought, certainty was expensive. She began with breathing. Not shooting, not theory, breathing. You can't control what you don't notice, she said, voice level, so notice this first. They shifted, some frowned. One rolled his shoulders like he was being denied something he'd earned. Dakota watched all of it. Again, she said. They obeyed, though not all of them understood why. Halfway through the morning, the general arrived. No entourage this time, no rank displayed beyond what couldn't be hidden. He stood back and observed. Dakota pretended she didn't see him. One of the trainees missed a shot badly, low, right, inconsistent with his previous grouping. He swore under his breath. Dakota crouched beside him. What changed? She asked. The wind, he said quickly. She shook her head. Your breathing, she corrected. You rushed it because you felt watched. He glanced toward the general. So did you, Dakota said softly. The difference is I learned how not to care. The general didn't smile, but his posture shifted. Later, when the range was quiet again, he approached her. You could have embarrassed him, he said. I could have, she agreed, but then he'd learned the wrong lesson. And the right one is. That someone's always watching, Dakota replied, but the shot doesn't belong to them. He nodded once. They walked together for a few steps before he spoke again. You know this won't stay small, he said. Word spreads. Dakota stopped walking. That's not my concern, she said. It will be, he replied gently, because people will start asking where you were. She met his eyes. Then tell them the truth. And that is, I was busy surviving, she said, like the rest of you. He studied her for a long moment. Someone reached out, he said carefully. Dakota didn't ask who. Did you respond? She asked instead. No, he said. I wanted to hear it from you first. She appreciated that more than she let on. I don't owe anyone from that time anything, she said, except silence. That time is knocking, he replied, quietly for now. Dakota looked back toward the range where targets stood waiting, unjudging, honest. I won't lead missions, she said. I won't be a symbol. Just a teacher, he asked. Just a person, she corrected. He nodded. That evening, the message she'd ignored finally turned into a call. She answered it on the third ring. You're hard to reach, a familiar voice said. So are regrets, Dakota replied. A pause. I didn't think you'd come back, the voice said. I didn't, she answered. I showed up. That pin was a mistake, Dakota interrupted. No, the voice said quietly. It was a signal. She closed her eyes. I'm not your signal, she said. I'm not anyone. Silence stretched between them, heavier than hostility. They're forming a unit, the voice continued. Quiet, selective. They want someone who knows when not to shoot. Dakota laughed short, humorless. Funny, she said. That used to be the hardest part. You were the best at it, the voice replied. She felt the old weight press against her ribs, the temptation to be needed, to matter in a way that had nothing to do with school lunches or bedtime stories. I'm someone else now, she said. So were we all, the voice answered, until we were. Dakota ended the call without goodbye. She sat there for a long time afterward, phone dark in her hand, heart steady but heavy. The past wasn't shouting. That was what scared her. It was waiting. And waiting had always been her weakness. Because some missions didn't announce themselves with gunfire. They arrived quietly and demanded everything anyway. Why did the range feel different the morning she realized she was being watched again? Not observed, watched. There was a difference, and Dakota felt it before she could name it. The air didn't change. The wind didn't shift. The targets stood exactly where she'd left them the night before, but something in her shoulders tightened as she stepped onto the gravel, like her body had recognized a familiar danger her mind hadn't caught up to yet. She slowed her pace. That was the first tell. Dakota had trained herself to move deliberately in normal life, measured, calm, unremarkable. But when instinct whispered, she listened. Always had. That instinct had kept her alive when plans failed and radios went dead. She scanned without appearing to scan. Reflections in metal, shadows that didn't belong to anyone assigned to this block. A vehicle parked a little too far from the admin building. She didn't acknowledge it. Instead, she focused on the trainees arriving in uneven clusters, laughter louder than it had been earlier in the week, nervous energy disguised as confidence, the kind that cracked fastest. She let them settle before speaking. "Today isn't about accuracy," she said. "It's about restraint." A few brows furrowed. One trainee tilted his head like he thought he'd misheard. "We don't train restraint," another said. "Not rude, just honest." Dakota met his eyes, held them. "You do," she replied. "You just don't call it that." She had them run drills without firing, breathing exercises under simulated stress, long holds, interrupted sequences. She made them reset repeatedly just before the shot would have broken. Frustration bloomed quickly. Good, she thought again. Because frustration revealed priorities. One trainee slammed a fist into the dirt after being stopped mid-sequence for the fourth time. "This is pointless," he muttered. Dakota crouched beside him, voice low. "Tell me what you felt right before I stopped you." He hesitated, then shrugged. "Ready," he said, "locked in." She shook her head gently. "No," she said, "you felt relieved, because once the shot breaks, responsibility ends." He frowned, confused. "That's a lie we tell ourselves," she continued. "The shot is when responsibility begins." She stood, leaving him with that thought like a weight he hadn't asked for but would carry anyway. From the corner of her eye, she noticed the general again. This time he wasn't alone. Two civilians, no uniforms, clean lines, the kind of posture that didn't belong on a range but knew how to blend into places like this without permission. Dakota's jaw tightened. So it had started. She ended training early. No explanation, no debrief, just a quiet dismissal that confused the trainees and irritated the ones who still believed in schedules. She packed her gear slower than usual. Not hesitation. Preparation. The general approached her near the armory door. "They're here," he said quietly. "I know," Dakota replied. "They want to talk." "I don't," she said. He didn't argue. That worried her more than if he had. "They know about the pin," he added. "Of course they do." "And about you." Dakota finally looked at him fully. "Which version?" she asked. He didn't answer right away. "That's the problem," he said eventually. "They don't see the difference." Neither did she some days. The meeting took place in a small office that smelled faintly of old paper and newer caution. No flags, no names on the door, just 4 chairs and a table that had heard more lies than truths. Dakota sat with her back to the wall. "Habit." One of the civilians introduced himself, the other didn't. She listened without interrupting as they spoke in careful language about threats that didn't exist yet, about probabilities, about gaps in capability. They spoke like people who had never pulled a trigger but understood the math of consequences. "We need someone who can assess without ego," the first man said. "Someone who understands when not to act." Dakota leaned back slightly. "You're looking for a myth," she said. "They tend to get people killed." The second man finally spoke. "We're looking for someone who walked away." That landed. She kept her face neutral. You think walking away makes someone pure, she asked, or just tired? The man didn't flinch. We think it makes them honest. Silence settled. Dakota felt the old anger stir. Not hot, cold, controlled. The kind that came from being reduced to a lesson instead of recognized as a person. You don't get to rewrite me, she said quietly. You don't get to decide what my absence meant. The first man raised his hand slightly. We're not here to force you. Good, she replied, because you can't. They slid a folder across the table anyway. She didn't open it. I have a life, Dakota said. I have a child. So do we, the first man said softly. That was a mistake. Dakota stood. Then you understand why I'm saying no. She left before they could respond. Outside, the sun felt harsher than it had an hour earlier. She squinted slightly, adjusting, breathing through the pressure building behind her ribs. She hated that they were right. Not about needing her. About why she'd walked away. It hadn't been bravery, or clarity, or moral awakening. It had been exhaustion. The kind that hollowed you out until the only thing left was the instinct to protect something smaller than yourself. That instinct was standing at home, waiting for her to help with homework and ask about her day. Dakota drove away from base without looking back. That night she dreamed again. This time she was watching someone else through a scope, a younger woman, steady, focused, alone. Dakota tried to warn her. No sound came out. She woke with tears on her face and no memory of when they'd started. The next morning, she found a note on her truck. No envelope, no signature. Just coordinates. She crumpled the paper in her fist. They weren't supposed to know where she parked. She went to work anyway. Training felt heavier, conversations quieter. The trainees sensed something had shifted, even if they didn't know what. One of them stayed behind after dismissal. Are you leaving? He asked. Dakota studied him for a moment. Why would you ask that? He shrugged. People who matter always do. She felt something tighten in her chest. I'm still here, she said. For how long? He pressed. Dakota didn't answer. Because the truth scared her. She didn't know. That evening, she stood in her kitchen, staring at the crumpled coordinates smoothed out on the counter. She imagined what saying yes would mean. The nights away, the lies by omission, the way silence would creep back into her voice. She imagined saying no. The what-ifs, the headlines she'd never read, the consequences she'd never know she could have stopped. Her daughter laughed in the other room, something on television amusing her in a way that felt almost painfully normal. Dakota folded the paper once. Then again. She didn't throw it away. She placed it in the drawer beside the pen. Some decisions didn't demand immediacy. They demanded honesty. And Dakota was still learning how to tell the truth. To others, and to herself. What happens when the thing you've spent years avoiding finally stops asking politely? Dakota knew before the sun came up that the day would not go the way she planned. She felt it in the way her body woke before her alarm, alert without reason. In the way her breath came shallow for the first few seconds, like she had surfaced too quickly from deep water. The house was quiet, too quiet. Even the familiar creaks of cooling walls felt muted, as if the building itself were listening. She lay still, staring at the ceiling and counted heartbeats the way she used to count seconds between scans. 1, 2, 3. Enough time for a mistake, enough time to correct it. The drawer with the pin and the coordinates might as well have been glowing. She didn't open it. Instead, she made breakfast, toast slightly burnt, coffee too strong. The ordinary rituals grounded her in a way nothing else could. Her daughter shuffled in, hair tangled, eyes half closed, and leaned against Dakota's side like it was the most natural thing in the world. "You're up early," her daughter mumbled. "Couldn't sleep," Dakota said. "Bad dreams." Dakota paused, then nodded. Her daughter didn't ask more. She never did. She had learned, somehow, that not all truths needed to be spoken to be shared. At the base, the atmosphere had shifted again. Not dramatically, not obviously, but Dakota had spent 2 long reading rooms not to notice the micro changes, conversations stopping when she passed, averted eyes, an extra second of attention paid to her movements. She hadn't said yes. She hadn't said no. That made people nervous. Training that morning was harder, not because Dakota pushed them physically, but because she pushed them inward. She asked questions with no clean answers. She made them sit with uncertainty longer than was comfortable. One trainee finally spoke what the others were thinking. "Why are you doing this?" he asked, not angry, just tired. Dakota looked at him for a long moment. "Because one day," she said, "you'll be the only calm thing in a very loud moment, and you won't have time to figure out who you are then." They absorbed that in silence. After training, the general called her into his office. No observers this time. No civilians waiting in the shadows. "You didn't respond," he said. "I'm still breathing," Dakota replied. "That counts as a response." He almost smiled. "They won't wait forever," he said. "They're not used to being ignored." Dakota folded her arms. "They'll survive," she said. "They always do." The general studied her like he was trying to solve an equation with too many variables. "You're afraid," he said finally. She didn't deny it. "I'm cautious," she corrected. "That's not what this is." Dakota exhaled slowly. "I'm afraid of being right," she said, "and afraid of being wrong." He nodded, like that was the answer he'd expected. "There's a difference between stepping back and abandoning what you know," he said. "I haven't abandoned anything," she replied. "I've repurposed it." "For how long?" That question stayed with her long after she left his office. That evening the call came again. She didn't answer. The third call came an hour later. She still didn't answer. The fourth came just after midnight. She picked up. "We don't have time anymore," the voice said. "No pleasantries, no nostalgia." Dakota closed her eyes. "You never do," she replied. "This isn't theoretical," the voice continued. "We're already behind." "You always say that too." A pause, then quieter. "This one involves a trainee, former, someone you trained years ago." Dakota's chest tightened. "You don't get to use people like leverage," she said. "We're not," the voice replied. "We're asking for context. You're the only one who understands how she thinks." Dakota said nothing. "She didn't go rogue," the voice added. "She made a choice, and we don't know why." Dakota felt the old ache stir, pride mixed with fear. The worst combination. "What do you want from me?" she asked. "Assessment," the voice said. "Not action. You observe, you advise, nothing more." Dakota almost laughed. She had heard that promise before. "Send the file," she said. The silence on the other end was immediate, reverent. "You're not saying yes," the voice said carefully. "I'm saying I'll look," Dakota replied. "Don't confuse the two." The file arrived 10 minutes later. Dakota sat at her kitchen table long after the house had gone quiet again, scrolling through details she recognized too easily. Patterns, decisions, small deviations that meant everything. She saw herself in the margins, not in the actions, but in the reasoning behind them. That scared her more than any threat assessment. At dawn she went for a run, hard, fast, until her lungs burned and her thoughts scattered. The sky lightened slowly, indifferent to her internal conflict. By the time she returned, sweat-soaked and breathless, she knew what she would do. Not because it was right. Because it was necessary. She told her daughter she had to travel for work. The lie was careful, softened at the edges, almost believable. Her daughter hugged her tightly, arms small but fierce. "Be safe," she said. Dakota closed her eyes. "I always try," she replied. The location was remote but familiar in its isolation. Not hostile, not friendly, just empty enough to hide intentions. Dakota arrived without insignia, without ceremony. She blended into the background like she always had. The team didn't know who she was at first, just another analyst, another voice in the room. She listened more than she spoke. When she finally did speak, the room went quiet. "That assumption will get someone killed," she said calmly. A few heads turned, a few brows furrowed. "And you are?" someone asked. "Someone who's made that mistake," she replied. The former trainee appeared on the screen moments later, calm, focused, unafraid. Dakota studied her face. Not broken. Not lost. Determined. "She's not your enemy," Dakota said. "That remains to be seen," someone replied. Dakota shook her head. "No," she said, "it doesn't." The realization settled slowly. This wasn't about stopping someone. It was about understanding why they'd stepped off the path. Dakota felt something shift inside her, not a return to who she was, but an acceptance of who she'd become. She wasn't here to pull the trigger. She was here to keep someone else from having to. As the operation unfolded, not in gunfire, but in tense conversations and fragile trust, Dakota felt the weight of every choice press against her ribs. She carried it. She always had. When it was over, when the trainee stood down without a shot fired, Dakota stepped back into the shadows without waiting for thanks. The voice called her again later. "You were right," it said. Dakota stared out at the dark. "That's not a victory," she replied. "But it mattered." "Yes," she said softly, "it did." On the flight home, she slept for the first time in days. Not peacefully, but honestly, because some missions don't ask you to return to who you were. They ask you to become someone capable of restraint. Even when action would be easier. Even when silence feels heavy. And even when walking away costs more than staying ever did. Why did coming home feel harder than leaving ever had? Dakota noticed it the moment her feet touched the tarmac. Not relief, not comfort, something heavier, like gravity had increased without warning. Leaving had required resolve. Returning required reconciliation with the version of herself that had stepped back into the world she'd sworn she was done with. The house looked the same. The street sounded the same. Her daughter's backpack still leaned against the wall where it always did. Normality waited for her patiently, unaware of how close it had come to being disrupted. Dakota stood in the doorway longer than necessary, hand on the frame, listening to the quiet. She had learned long ago that silence could mean safety or danger depending on who controlled it. This silence was honest. That mattered. Her daughter came around the corner, eyes lighting up before confusion followed. "You're back early," she said. Dakota smiled, a real one this time. "Plans changed." Her daughter didn't question it. She wrapped her arms around Dakota's waist with the kind of trust that felt undeserved, and yet absolutely earned at the same time. Dakota held on longer than usual, grounding herself in the warmth, the weight, the reminder of why restraint mattered more than precision ever could. That night after dinner and homework and a story read twice because neither of them wanted the day to end yet, Dakota sat alone on the porch. The air was cool, the sky clear, stars sharp enough to hurt if you stared too long. Her phone rested beside her. No messages, no calls. That too felt deliberate. She should have felt finished. Instead, she felt visible. The following weeks passed without incident but not without change. Dakota returned to training with a quieter authority than before. She didn't mention where she'd been. No one asked. But the way people listened shifted. Less curiosity, more attention. She noticed the trainees watching each other more closely, asking better questions, taking longer before breaking a shot. It wasn't dramatic, it was subtle. It was everything. One afternoon, the trainee who had once accused the drills of being pointless stayed behind again. He hesitated before speaking, like he was weighing whether the question was worth the risk. "You didn't stop her," he said finally. Dakota didn't pretend not to understand. "No," she replied. "But you could have." "Yes." "So why didn't you?" Dakota considered him, not his rank, not his posture, him. "Because stopping someone isn't the same as saving them," she said. "And because sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do is assume you're right." He absorbed that slowly. "Doesn't that make things uncertain?" he asked. "Yes," she said simply. He nodded, thoughtful. "I think I understand," he said. "I don't like it, but I think I understand." Dakota watched him walk away, shoulders a little straighter than before. That night the drawer called to her again. She opened it. The pin lay beside the folded coordinates, both smaller than the space they occupied in her mind. She picked up the pin, turning it between her fingers. It felt heavier than metal should. Once it had meant belonging, then it had meant survival. Now it meant accountability. She didn't put it back in the drawer. Instead, she placed it on the kitchen counter, where she would have to see it in the morning. The call came 3 days later. Different voice, same careful tone. "We'd like you to consult," the voice said. "Nothing operational, advisory only." Dakota closed her eyes. "I'm not interested in being a conscience you can ignore," she replied. A pause. "We wouldn't ask if we intended to," the voice said. She almost laughed. "You always say that too." Another pause, longer this time. "We failed someone," the voice admitted. "We don't want to do it again." Dakota felt the words settle, not dramatic, not manipulative. Just human. "Send me what you have," she said. "I'll tell you what I think. You won't like all of it." "That's acceptable." "No," Dakota corrected. "That's necessary." She didn't tell her daughter this time. There was nothing to tell. No travel, no departure. Just late nights at the table, files spread out where math homework usually lived. The overlap felt strange but honest. She found herself speaking up more, pushing back harder, asking questions others avoided because they complicated timelines and diluted certainty. "You're slowing this down," someone complained during one briefing. Dakota met his eyes through the screen. "Good," she said. "That means you're thinking." The work didn't give her the old rush. No spike of adrenaline, no sense of being essential. Instead, it gave her something steadier. Purpose without erasure. One evening, as she closed her laptop, her daughter looked up from the couch. "You're different," she said. Dakota tensed slightly. "Different how?" Her daughter shrugged. "Calmer," she said, "but also heavier." Dakota smiled faintly. "That's fair." "Is that bad?" Dakota shook her head. "No," she said. "It just means I care about the weight now." Her daughter nodded like that made sense, then went back to her show. Weeks later, the general invited Dakota for coffee, off base, neutral ground. "You didn't have to come," he said as she sat down. "I wanted to," she replied. He studied her for a moment. "You're changing things," he said. "So are you," she answered. He smiled at that. "They listen to you," he said. "Not always." "Enough." Dakota looked out the window, watching people pass by who had no idea how many decisions had been made quietly on their behalf. "I don't want a legacy," she said. The general nodded. "Neither did most people who left one." She considered that. Later that night, Dakota stood in her kitchen again, pen in hand. She attached it not to her collar but to the inside of her jacket, hidden, close. Not a symbol. A reminder. She wasn't done choosing. She was choosing differently. Because strength, she was learning, wasn't about the moments when you pulled the trigger or refused to. It was about the long, quiet hours afterward, when no one was watching, when no one would ever know what it cost, and you decided anyway to carry the weight, so someone else wouldn't have to. Why did the smallest sound, the click of a pin against metal, feel louder than any gunshot she'd ever heard? Dakota stood alone in the kitchen before dawn, jacket draped over the chair, the house wrapped in that fragile quiet that existed only before the day decided what it would demand. The pin caught the low light as she adjusted it one last time on the inside seam. Hidden, intentional, close to her heart, where reminders mattered more than recognition. She paused, fingers lingering there. For years she had believed endings arrived with clarity, a final shot, a final order, a moment that divided before and after so cleanly you could point to it. But this felt different, softer, heavier, like a door left ajar instead of slammed shut. She poured coffee and didn't drink it. The steam rose and faded. Time moved anyway. Her daughter appeared in the doorway, rubbing sleep from her eyes. "You're up early again," she said. Dakota turned, smiled, and felt the truth of it stretch across her chest. "So are you." Her daughter padded into the kitchen and climbed onto a chair, swinging her legs absent-mindedly. "Are you going somewhere?" she asked. Dakota hesitated, just for a second. "No," she said, "I'm staying." Her daughter nodded, satisfied, as if that answer resolved something she hadn't put words to yet. "Good," she said, "I have a presentation today." Dakota smiled wider this time. "Then I'll be here to hear all about it." The morning passed like a promise kept. Drop-off, a wave through the car window, that small, ordinary ache of watching someone you love walk into a world you can't always protect them from. Dakota sat in the parked car for a moment after, hands resting on the steering wheel, breathing in time with her heartbeat. This, she told herself, was the mission now. At the base, the general waited in a conference room that felt deliberately undecorated. No flags, no plaques, just a table, 2 chairs, and the weight of conversations that mattered. "You look settled," he said when she entered. "I am," Dakota replied. He nodded, accepting that without comment. "They're formalizing things," he said. "Not a unit, a doctrine." Dakota raised an eyebrow slightly. "That sounds dangerous." "It can be," he agreed, "or it can save lives." "And you want me to write it," she said. "Not alone," he replied, "but yes, your voice matters here." Dakota leaned back, considering. "Then it won't be about marksmanship," she said, "or heroism." "Good," he said, "we have enough of that." "It'll be about restraint," she continued, "about uncertainty, about knowing when the right answer is to wait." The general smiled faintly. "That's exactly what scares them." "Then we're doing it right," Dakota replied. She spent the next weeks in rooms that used to exhaust her. Briefings, reviews, debates where certainty was currency and doubt was treated like a flaw. Dakota brought doubt anyway, not recklessly, carefully, like a scalpel. She challenged assumptions, questioned urgency, asked what success actually meant and who paid for it when definitions were wrong. Not everyone appreciated it. "You're slowing momentum," one senior voice complained. Dakota met his gaze. "Momentum without direction is just impact," she said, "and impact isn't the same as progress." Silence followed. Not agreement, but consideration. At the range, she noticed the difference before anyone commented on it. Trainees hesitated longer, checked their surroundings more thoroughly, asked for peer review instead of validation. One afternoon, the same trainee who had once slammed his fist into the dirt approached her quietly. I didn't take the shot, he said. Dakota waited. It was clean, he continued. Clear, but something felt off. What did you do? She asked. I waited, he said, and then I realized someone else had moved into the background. I would have missed it. Dakota nodded once. That's the job, she said. He swallowed. It felt wrong, he admitted, not shooting. It always does, she replied, at first. The call came that night. No code words, no urgency. Just a voice she hadn't expected. You were right, it said. Dakota closed her eyes. I know, she replied. That's not why I'm listening. We didn't act, the voice continued. We waited, it changed everything. Dakota leaned against the counter, feeling the weight settle, not as a burden, but as confirmation. That's good, she said quietly. We wanted you to know. I do, she replied. Now let it go. The line went dead. Weeks turned into months. Dakota's life found a rhythm that didn't demand she fracture herself to function. Early mornings, thoughtful work, evenings filled with homework questions and laughter that didn't echo like gunfire in her head. The pen stayed where it was. One day the general passed her in the corridor. He stopped, glanced at her jacket, then back to her face. You never wear it openly, he observed. Dakota shook her head. It's not for them. He nodded, understanding. Do you miss it? He asked. She considered the question, longer than she expected to. No, she said finally, I respect it. There was a difference. The last scene unfolded quietly. No operation, no briefing. Just Dakota standing at the range alone at sunset, rifle resting on the bench, untouched. The light painted long shadows across the targets, stretching distance until everything looked further away than it was. She didn't lie down. She didn't shoulder the weapon. She stood there, hands relaxed at her sides, listening to the wind and remembering all the times she'd trusted it more than words. She thought of the girl she had trained who chose her own path, of the trainees now learning that strength could be silent, of her daughter growing up with a mother who came home, not empty, not haunted, but whole enough. Dakota turned away from the rifle. She walked off the range as the sun dipped below the horizon, leaving the targets unmarked, unbroken. Because not every story ends with a shot. Some end with restraint, with presence, with the quiet, stubborn courage it takes to stay, to teach, to question, to choose weight over ease. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It doesn't demand recognition or carve its name into history. Sometimes dignity simply acts, and then steps aside, letting the world move forward without needing to know who held it steady.